The room went silent the second the boy said yes. Not the polite kind of silence, the kind where 30 people stop breathing at the same time. Grant Holloway, billionaire, untouchable, always in control, stood across from a 12-year-old in clothes that didn't fit and smiled like a man who'd already won. "One hand of poker," he said. "If I win, your mother works extra shifts. No pay." The phones came out immediately. Dozens of them. Recording everything. The boy didn't move, didn't cry, didn't beg. He just stared at the cards on the table like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. His mother stood in the corner, trapped between fear and rent money, watching her son walk into a trap designed to humiliate him. But here's the thing. Nobody saw coming. The boy wasn't scared. He was ready. And in less than 10 minutes, everyone in that room would realize they'd made a terrible mistake. The penthouse sat 47 floors above the city. Up here, the noise didn't reach. The sirens, the traffic, the people who worked 3 jobs to keep a studio apartment. None of it made it past the glass. Grant Holloway stood near the window, a drink in his hand, surrounded by people who laughed before he finished his jokes. Tech investors. Influencers with millions of followers. A former congressman. They didn't come here for the view. They came because being seen here mattered. Grant raised his glass. "To disruption," he said. Everyone drank. The poker table sat in the center of the room, green felt under soft light. Cards and chips waited. This wasn't a casino. No rules hung on the wall. No cameras from the state watched what happened here. Just phones. Dozens of them. Pointed at everything. One woman leaned toward her screen. "This place is insane," she whispered to her followers. Grant smiled. He liked that word. Insane. It meant untouchable. A man in a tailored suit set down his glass. "You really never lose, do you?" Grant shrugged. "I don't play. Games I can't win." Laughter rolled through the room again. It always did. Not because he was funny, because agreeing with him felt safer than not. Caleb Monroe sat at the poker table, quiet. He didn't laugh. He'd run games like this for 30 years, played in World Series finals, won money most people couldn't count. Now he just watched. His job wasn't to play anymore. It was to make sure no one cheated. But up here, in a room like this, cheating wasn't the danger. Arrogance was. Grant walked toward the table, rolling up his sleeves. "All right. Who's brave tonight?" 3 hands went up immediately. A venture capitalist, a crypto founder, a former athlete trying to stay relevant. Grant looked at them the way a teacher looks at students who got the answer wrong. "Boring," he said. Then his eyes moved past them, toward the corner of the room, toward the woman refilling water glasses without making a sound. Maribel Cross kept her head down. She'd worked in this penthouse for 2 years. She knew the rules. Be invisible. Be fast. Don't react to anything you hear. She was good at it. But tonight Grant wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the boy standing beside her. Elijah didn't move. His hands stayed at his sides. His face didn't change. He was 12, small for his age, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. He didn't belong in a room like this. And Grant noticed. "You," Grant said, pointing. The room went quiet. Maribel's hand froze on the pitcher. Elijah looked up. Grant smiled. "You play poker, kid?" Maribel didn't answer for him. She'd learned not to. 2 years in this penthouse taught her that speaking up only made things worse. The rich didn't like being interrupted. They didn't like being corrected. And they definitely didn't like being reminded that the help had opinions. So she stayed quiet. Elijah stayed quiet too. He always did. Grant took a step closer. His shoes made no sound on the marble floor. Everything in this place was expensive enough to be silent. "I asked you a question," Grant said, still smiling. Elijah nodded once. "That's a yes?" Grant turned to the room. "He speaks sign language now?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not loud, just enough to let Grant know they were paying attention. Maribel's jaw tightened. She didn't look at her son. She didn't look at Grant. She looked at the picture in her hand and reminded herself that rent was due in 8 days. Grant crouched down, putting himself at eye level with Elijah. It was the kind of thing people do when they want to seem kind, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "What's your name?" "Elijah." "Elijah." Grant repeated it slowly, like he was tasting it. "You come here a lot?" "Sometimes." "Sometimes." Grant glanced back at the room. "Kid doesn't say much, does he?" Someone laughed. Another person raised their phone higher. Grant stood up, brushing off his knees like he'd touched something dirty. "You know what poker is, Elijah?" "Yes." "You any good?" Elijah didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't know what to say, because he was thinking about whether the truth mattered here. It didn't. "I don't know," Elijah said. Grant's smile widened. "Honest kid. I like that." Maribel finally looked up. Her eyes met Grant's for less than a second, just long enough to send a message. "Please don't." Grant saw it. He always saw things like that. Fear was easy to spot when you'd spent your whole life making people feel it. He turned back to Elijah. "Tell you what," Grant said. "How about we find out? You and me. One hand." The room shifted. Phones angled toward the table. Someone whispered, "Is he serious?" Caleb Monroe didn't move, but his eyes narrowed. He'd seen this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. Rich men didn't play poker with 12-year-olds because they wanted competition. They did it because humiliation was entertaining. Maribel's hand tightened around the pitcher. Water sloshed against the glass. Elijah looked at his mother. She didn't shake her head. She didn't nod. She just looked back at him with the same expression she always had when the world pressed down too hard. Steady, tired, unbroken. Elijah turned back to Grant. "Okay." Grant clapped his hands once. "There we go." The room erupted. Not in cheers, in something worse. Anticipation. Elijah walked toward the poker table. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He just moved. The crowd parted without thinking about it. Not out of respect, out of curiosity. Grant was already sitting down, shuffling a deck with the confidence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. He wasn't good at it. The cards bent slightly in his hands, but no one corrected him. Elijah pulled out the chair across from him. It was too tall. His feet didn't touch the ground. Someone snickered. Grant didn't look up. "You need a booster seat, kid?" More laughter, sharper this time. Elijah didn't respond. He just sat there, hands flat on the table, watching. Grant's fingers moved through the deck. Grant noticed. "Something wrong?" "No," Elijah said, but his eyes didn't move. They stayed locked on the cards, not on Grant, not on the people holding up their phones, just the cards. Grant slid the deck toward Caleb. "You deal." Caleb picked up the cards without a word. His hands moved differently than Grant's, smooth, precise. 30 years of muscle memory made it look like the deck was liquid. He dealt 2 cards to Elijah, 2 to Grant. Elijah didn't touch his cards right away. He looked at them where they sat, face down, waiting. Grant flipped his over immediately, glancing at them before setting them back down. Confident. Casual. Elijah reached out slowly. He lifted the corner of the first card, looked at it, set it down, lifted the second, looked at it, set it down. His face didn't change. Grant leaned back in his chair. "You know how this works, right? You're supposed to react." Elijah didn't answer. One of the guests leaned toward another. "Is he scared or stupid?" "Both," someone whispered back. But Caleb wasn't laughing. He was watching Elijah's hands, the way they moved, deliberate, controlled, no wasted motion. That wasn't fear, that was discipline. Grant tapped the table. All right, let's make this interesting. What do you want to bet? Elijah looked at him. I don't have money. Of course you don't, Grant smiled. So let's say if you win, I give your mom a bonus. 5 grand, cash. Maribel's breath caught. She didn't mean for anyone to hear it, but in a room this quiet, everything landed. Grant's smile stretched wider. And if I win? He paused, letting the silence do the work. She works an extra shift this week. No pay. The room went still. Caleb's hand stopped mid-reach for the deck. One of the influencers lowered her phone. Just for a second. Like even she knew this had gone somewhere ugly. Maribel didn't move. She couldn't. Rent was due in 8 days. She had $340 in her account. If she lost hours, she lost the apartment. If she lost the apartment, she lost everything. Elijah looked at his mother. She didn't shake her head. She didn't mouth the word no. She just stood there, trapped between pride and panic, waiting for her 12-year-old son to make a decision no child should ever have to make. Elijah turned back to Grant. Okay. Grant clapped his hands together. Now we're talking. Caleb dealt the flop. 3 cards face up in the center of the table. Elijah stared at them. Not like he was calculating, like he was memorizing. Grant glanced at the cards, then at Elijah. You gonna bet or just sit there? Elijah's eyes didn't move. I'll wait, he said quietly. And something in the way he said it made the room feel smaller. Grant leaned forward, elbows on the table. You know what I love about poker? Elijah didn't answer. It's honest, Grant continued. Strip away the fancy degrees, the right last name, the trust fund. Poker doesn't care. You either have the cards or you don't. He said it like he believed it, like he hadn't been born into money, like his first company wasn't funded by his father's friends, like every risk he ever took had a safety net made of other people's wealth. The room nodded along. They always did. Grant tapped the table twice. Your move, kid. Elijah looked at the 3 cards on the table, then at his own, then back at Grant. Check, Elijah said. Grant's eyebrows went up. Check? You sure about that? Elijah nodded. All right then. Grant pushed a stack of chips forward. I'll bet. He didn't say how much. It didn't matter. There was no money on Elijah's side of the table, just consequences. Caleb dealt the 4th card, the turn. Grant glanced at it. His face didn't change, but his fingers drummed once against the felt. Excited, confident. He looked at Elijah. You're in over your head, aren't you? Elijah didn't respond. It's okay, Grant said, louder now, playing to the crowd. This is a teaching moment. You're learning something valuable tonight. What's that? Elijah asked. Grant smiled. That luck runs out. The room laughed. Phones angled closer. One woman whispered into her camera, This is brutal. Maribel stood against the wall, hands clasped in front of her. She wasn't allowed to sit. Staff didn't sit in rooms like this. They stood. They waited. They disappeared when convenient. Her son was sitting at a table with a man who could destroy her life without thinking twice. And there was nothing she could do. Grant leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. You know, Maribel, you raised a polite kid. I respect that. Maribel didn't answer. She'd learned that silence was safer than gratitude. But polite doesn't win poker, Grant added. He turned to Elijah. Does it? Elijah looked at him. Really looked at him. Not at his expensive watch. Not at the custom suit. At his eyes. No, Elijah said quietly. It doesn't. Grant grinned. See? He's learning. He pushed more chips forward. I'm all in. The room went silent. Caleb's fingers paused on the deck. You sure? Grant didn't even look at him. I'm sure. All in, on a hand against a 12-year-old, with his mother's rent on the line. Not because he needed to win, because he wanted to. One of the guests whispered, "He's really doing this." Another one laughed softly. Of course he is. Grant looked at Elijah. So what's it gonna be, kid? You fold, your mom keeps her normal schedule. You call and we see what happens. Elijah's hand stayed flat on the table. He didn't fidget. He didn't look at his mother. He didn't ask Caleb for advice. He just sat there, thinking. Grant's smile started to fade, just a little, because silence wasn't supposed to be an option here. Fear was supposed to make people move faster. Panic was supposed to make them sloppy. But Elijah wasn't panicking. He was waiting. Finally, Elijah spoke. Call. Grant's smile came back wider than before. There we go. Caleb dealt the final card. The river. It hit the table with a soft snap. Grant looked at it, looked at his cards, looked at Elijah. You ready to see what real pressure looks like? Grant asked. Elijah met his eyes. I've been ready, he said. Grant flipped his cards over first. King of hearts, king of diamonds, pair of kings. The room reacted immediately. Gasps, whispers. Someone said, no way. Grant spread his arms wide. Read 'em and weep, kid. He wasn't talking to Elijah anymore. He was talking to the phones, to the followers, to the people who'd clip this moment and share it 1,000 times by morning. He was talking to everyone except the boy sitting across from him. Elijah stared at the cards. His face didn't move. Grant leaned forward. You gonna show me yours? Or do I have to guess? Elijah's hand stayed on the table. Show them, Grant said again, louder this time. Caleb shifted in his seat. Kid, you have to reveal your hand. Elijah reached for his cards. Slow, deliberate. He flipped the first one. 3 of clubs. Grant's grin got wider. Elijah flipped the second one. 7 of spades. The room exploded. Laughter. Loud, unfiltered laughter. Not the polite kind from earlier. This was the kind that came when people felt safe, when they knew they were on the winning side. Grant slapped the table. 3 and a 7? That's what you called all in with? Elijah didn't answer. Grant stood up, arms raised like he'd just won a championship. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when you bet with heart instead of brains. More laughter, phones everywhere, dozens of screens capturing the moment from every angle. Maribel's face went pale. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stood there, frozen, watching her son lose something she couldn't protect him from. Grant walked around the table, clapping Elijah on the shoulder. Hey, don't feel bad. You lasted longer than I thought you would. Elijah still didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the center of the table. On the 5 community cards lying face up in a row. 9 of hearts, 4 of diamonds, 6 of clubs, 5 of spades, 8 of hearts. Grant turned to the crowd. All right, who wants to... Wait, Caleb said. Grant stopped mid-sentence. What? Caleb wasn't looking at Grant. He was looking at the table, at the 5 community cards, at Elijah's 2 cards lying beside them. His face changed. What? Grant said again, irritation creeping into his voice. Caleb pointed at the cards. Look at the board. Grant looked. Yeah, I see it. I won. No, Caleb said slowly. You didn't. The room went quiet. Grant's smile flickered. What are you talking about? Caleb pointed again. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. He paused. The kid has a straight. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was disbelief. Grant stared at the table. His mouth opened, closed, opened, again. One of the guests leaned forward, squinting. Wait, is that a straight? Caleb repeated. 7 high. Beats a pair. Grant's face went red. That's not… He didn't… He did, Caleb said. His voice was flat, professional. The voice of someone who'd called wins and losses for 30 years and didn't care about anything except the truth. Grant looked at Elijah. Elijah looked back. You knew, Grant said quietly. Elijah didn't answer. You knew the whole time. Still nothing. Grant's jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The room wasn't laughing anymore. The phones were still recording, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was exposure. Maribel's hand went to her mouth, not in shock, in relief. Grant turned to Caleb. Deal again. Caleb shook his head. Game's over. I said deal again. No. Grant's voice dropped. I'm not asking. Caleb stood up. And I'm not dealing. The room held its breath. Grant stared at him, then at Elijah, then at the cards on the table. And for the first time all night, he had nothing to say. Grant didn't sit back down. He stood there, staring at the cards like they'd betrayed him, like the deck itself had conspired against him. Someone in the crowd coughed. Another person shifted their weight. The phones kept recording. Grant finally turned to Elijah. You got lucky. Elijah didn't respond. That's all this was. Grant continued, voice rising. Dumb luck. You didn't know what you were doing. Elijah's eyes stayed on the table. Grant pointed at the cards. You called with a 3 and a 7. That's not strategy. That's stupidity. Caleb crossed his arms. Stupidity doesn't win straights. Grant's head snapped toward him. Stay out of this. I'm already in it, Caleb said. I dealt the hand. Grant's face was still red, his jaw tight. He looked like a man who'd just been told his empire was built on sand. One of the guests whispered to another, Should we leave? Not yet, the other one whispered back. This is too good. Grant turned back to Elijah. You don't even know what you did, do you? Elijah looked up at him. I won. The simplicity of it landed like a slap. Grant's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He wasn't used to being stripped down to 2 words, to having someone say exactly what happened without decoration, without fear. He stepped closer to the table. You think you're smart? Elijah didn't answer. I asked you a question. No, Elijah said quietly. Grant blinked. What? I don't think I'm smart. Grant laughed, but it sounded wrong. Hollow. Then what do you think you are? Elijah paused, not because he didn't know the answer, because he was deciding whether to say it. Patient, he said. The word hung in the air. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward slightly, watching Elijah the way a teacher watches a student who just said something they shouldn't understand yet. Grant scoffed. Patient. That's cute, But his voice didn't have the same bite anymore. Someone in the crowd muttered, What does that even mean? Maribel knew. She'd watched her son sit in corners of rooms like this for 2 years. Quiet. Still. Watching people play cards while she refilled drinks, watching them laugh, watching them bet, watching them lose. He hadn't been bored. He'd been learning. Grant picked up the deck from the table. You want to go again? Caleb stood up. No, I wasn't asking you. You should be, Caleb said, because I'm the only one here who knows what just happened. Grant turned on him. Then enlighten me. Caleb looked at Elijah, then at Grant. He didn't get lucky, Caleb said. He waited for you to overcommit. He let you think you were in control, and then he let you bury yourself. The room went still. Grant stared at Caleb. He's 12. That doesn't make it less true. Grant's hand tightened around the deck, cards bent under his grip. One of the influencers lowered her phone, not to stop recording, to get a better angle. Grant looked at Elijah, really looked at him this time. Not at a kid, not at a punchline, at someone who just made him look like a fool in front of 30 people with cameras. "You set me up," Grant said. Elijah shook his head. "You set yourself up." And that's when Grant realized it. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was deliberate. His voice dropped to a whisper. "How long have you been watching?" Elijah met his eyes. 2 years. The room didn't laugh this time. It didn't gasp. It just watched. Because everyone in that penthouse had just realized the same thing Grant did. The invisible kid wasn't invisible anymore. You just watched a 12-year-old tell a billionaire he's been studying him for 2 years. In silence, in corners, while everyone thought he was invisible. And now you understand. This wasn't luck. This was patience. If you felt that shift, that moment where everything you thought you knew flipped upside down, then you're exactly where I want you to be. Because what happens next isn't just about Elijah winning, it's about what it costs, what it changes, and why moments like this matter. I don't tell stories that waste your time. I tell stories that stay with you. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe. Because the next 3 chapters will show you why this night will follow Grant Holloway for the rest of his life. And trust me, you don't want to miss that. Caleb sat back down. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Elijah the way a mechanic looks at an engine that shouldn't be running, but is. Grant was still standing, still holding the bent deck, still trying to process what he'd just heard. 2 years. One of the guests broke the silence. "Wait, so he's been here before?" "Every Thursday," Maribel said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She hadn't spoken since the game started. Now her voice cut through the room like a blade. "I bring him when I work late," she continued. "He sits in the corner, does his homework, stays quiet." Grant's eyes went wide. "You've been bringing him here?" "You never said I couldn't." Grant opened his mouth, closed it, because she was right. He'd never noticed. None of them had. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Kid, how many games have you watched?" Elijah thought about it. "Maybe 100. 100, Caleb repeated. He wasn't angry. He was impressed. "And you just sat there? Watching?" Elijah nodded. "You never played before tonight?" "No." Caleb let out a slow breath. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard." One of the guests laughed nervously. "Come on, he got lucky. That's all." Caleb didn't look at him. Luck doesn't recognize betting patterns. Luck doesn't wait for the right moment. Luck doesn't know when someone's bluffing. He pointed at Elijah. "This kid read the table better than half the professionals I've worked with." Grant's voice came out sharp. "He's 12. "Yeah," Caleb said, "and he just beat you." The room shifted again, uncomfortable, tense, because this wasn't a joke anymore. This wasn't entertainment. This was witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible. Caleb turned to Elijah. "When I dealt the flop, you checked. Why?" Elijah looked at the card still lying on the table. "Because I didn't have the straight yet." "But you knew you could get it?" "I knew it was possible." "And when Grant went all in, you called. Why?" Elijah paused. "Because he thought I was scared." Caleb nodded slowly. "And you weren't?" "No." "Why not?" Elijah looked at Grant, then back at Caleb. "Because I knew what he had." The room went silent. Grant's voice cracked. "That's impossible." Caleb didn't take his eyes off Elijah. "How?" "You look at your cards different when they're good," Elijah said. "Faster. You smile before you bet, and you always touch your watch when you're confident." Grant's hand was on his watch. He yanked it away like it had burned him. Caleb leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Unbelievable." One of the influencers whispered into her phone, "Are you guys seeing this?" Another guest muttered, "This kid's a prodigy." "No," Caleb said firmly. "He's not a prodigy." Everyone looked at him. "Prodigies are born with talent," Caleb continued. This kid built a skill. He sat in a corner for 2 years, watched 100 games, and learned how people think when they're holding cards. He looked at Elijah with something close to respect. That's not genius. That's discipline. Grant dropped the deck on the table, cards scattered across the felt. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice was weak now, hollow. Caleb stood up. "No. What's ridiculous is that you've been playing poker in front of him for 2 years and never once thought he was paying attention." He looked around the room, at the phones, at the guests, at the people who'd laughed 10 minutes ago. "That's the real mistake," Caleb said. "Thinking invisible means powerless." Elijah sat perfectly still, watching, waiting, like he always had. Grant stared at the cards on the table. His kings. Elijah's 3 and 7. The 5 community cards that built a straight no one saw coming. He'd gone all in. Not because he had to, because he wanted to humiliate a 12-year-old in front of 30 witnesses. And now those 30 witnesses had watched him lose. One of the guests cleared his throat. "So, does this mean—" "Shut up," Grant snapped. The room flinched. Grant's hands were shaking. Not a lot, just enough that everyone could see. He turned to Elijah. "You think you're clever?" Elijah didn't answer. "You think this changes anything?" Still nothing. Grant's voice got louder. "You're still nobody. Your mom still works for me. You still live in whatever dump you crawled out of." Maribel's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. Grant pointed at Elijah. "This was one hand. One. You got lucky once, and now you think you've won something." Caleb crossed his arms. "He did win something." "Stay out of this," Grant hissed. "You made the bet," Caleb said evenly. $5,000 if he won. You said it in front of everyone here." Grant's face went white. One of the influencers raised her phone higher. "Yeah, I got that on video." Another guest nodded. "Me too." Grant looked around the room, at the phones, at the faces, at the people who'd laughed with him 10 minutes ago and were now watching him like a live grenade. He forced a smile. "I was joking." Caleb didn't smile back. "Didn't sound like a joke." "It was," Grant insisted. "Obviously." "Then why'd you go all in?" Caleb asked. Grant's mouth opened, closed. No answer came out, because there was no good answer. He went all in because he thought he'd win, because he wanted to see the look on a child's face when he lost everything, because cruelty was only fun when it was guaranteed. But it wasn't guaranteed. And now the cruelty had a witness list. One of the guests stepped forward. "Grant, just pay the kid." Grant spun toward him. "Excuse me? You made the bet, he won. Just pay him and move on." "I'm not paying him anything." The room went cold. Another guest shifted uncomfortably. "Dude, this is on camera." "I don't care." "You should," the guest said quietly, "because this is going to be everywhere by tomorrow." Grant's eyes darted to the phones, to the screens, to the little red dots that meant recording. His empire was built on image, on being the guy who disrupted industries, who took risks, who won, not the guy who refused to pay a 12-year-old after losing a poker hand he shouldn't have played in the first place. Caleb stood up. "You've got 2 choices, Grant. Pay what you owe or spend the next month explaining why you didn't." Grant's hands curled into fists. He looked at Elijah, at the boy who hadn't moved, hadn't gloated, hadn't said a single word since the cards were revealed. The boy who'd been invisible for 2 years and was now the only person in the room anyone would remember. Grant reached into his pocket. He pulled out his wallet, opened it, and counted out $5,000 in hundreds. He threw the money on the table. Bills scattered across the felt, mixing with the cards. "There," Grant said. "Happy now?" Elijah looked at the money, then at Grant. "No," he said quietly. Grant froze. "What?" Elijah stood up, slowly. His chair scraped against the marble floor. He walked around the table, picked up the bills, counted them, then walked over to his mother and handed them to her. Maribel's hands shook as she took the money. Elijah turned back to Grant. "Now I'm happy," he said. And for the first time all night, Grant had nothing left to say. The room didn't know what to do. Nobody clapped, nobody cheered, nobody moved. They just stood there, phones still recording, watching a 12-year-old boy hand $5,000 to his mother in a penthouse 47 floors above. The people who'd never see money like that in a month. Maribel folded the bills carefully. Once, twice, then slipped them into her apron pocket, or her hands stopped shaking. She looked at her son, not with pride, not with relief, with something quieter, something that didn't need a name. Grant stood frozen by the poker table. His face was red. His jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. One of the guests tried to break the tension. "Well, that was—" "Get out," Grant said. The guest blinked. "What?" "I said get out." "Grant, come on, we were just—" "All of you," Grant said louder. "Get out of my house." The room hesitated. Then, slowly, people started moving toward the door, picking up coats, pocketing phones, whispering to each, to other in low voices. One of the influencers muttered, "This is insane." Another replied, "This is content." Caleb gathered the cards from the table, stacking them neatly. He didn't look at Grant, didn't say goodbye, just walked toward the exit like a man who'd seen this play out 100 times before. Rich men didn't like losing. They liked it even less when people watched. Grant turned to Maribel. "You're fired." Maribel didn't flinch. "Okay. I'm serious." "I know." Grant's voice cracked. "You brought him here. You let him watch. I did my job," Maribel said calmly. "You're the one who made the bet." Grant's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Because she was right. He'd made the bet. He'd gone all in. He'd lost. And now everyone knew. Maribel took Elijah's hand. "We're leaving." Grant stepped in front of them. "You don't walk out of here like you won something." Elijah looked up at him. "I did win something." "Money," Grant spat. "That's all. You didn't. Prove anything." Elijah's face didn't change. "I proved you underestimated me." The words landed quiet, simple, true. Grant's hands trembled. "You're just a kid." "I know," Elijah said, "but you still lost to me." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was final. Maribel walked past Grant, pulling Elijah gently toward the door. Her head was high. Her steps were steady. She wasn't invisible anymore. Neither was her son. Grant stood alone in the center of his penthouse, surrounded by scattered cards and empty chairs, and the ghost of 30 people who'd just watched him fall apart. The poker table sat under the soft light. Green felt stained with embarrassment. He looked at the deck Caleb left behind, at the kings still lying face up. A winning hand. That lost. One of the guests paused at the door, looking back. "You all right, man?" Grant didn't answer. The guest left. The door closed. And for the first time in years, Grant Holloway was alone in a room he owned, with nothing to say and no one to hear it. He sat down at the poker table, picked up the cards, stared at them, and realized something he should have known from the start. The game was never about the cards. It was about who was watching. And tonight, everyone was. 47 floors below, Maribel and Elijah stepped out onto the street. The city noise hit them all at once. Sirens, cars, people shouting, life moving fast and loud and indifferent. Maribel stopped on the sidewalk. She pulled the money from her pocket, looked at it, then looked at her son. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Elijah shrugged. "Yes, I did." "Why?" He thought about it for a moment. "Because he thought we were nothing," Elijah said, "and I wanted him to be wrong." Maribel's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just pulled him close. And they walked home. 3 weeks later, the video had 40 million views. Someone clipped the moment Grant went all in. The moment Caleb revealed. The straight. The moment Elijah said, 2 years. It spread like wildfire. Tech blogs picked it up. News outlets ran stories. People who'd never played poker in their lives were suddenly experts on betting patterns and table reads. Grant Holloway's name was everywhere, but not the way he wanted. The headline that stuck was simple: Billionaire humiliated by 12-year-old in poker game. His company's stock dropped 3% in 2 days. Not enough to ruin him, but enough to sting. Investors started asking questions. Board members requested meetings. His publicist quit. Grant stopped hosting poker nights. He stopped posting on social media. He stayed in his penthouse, 47 floors above a city that had moved on without asking his permission. Maribel didn't go back. She found work at a hotel downtown. Better pay, better hours. They didn't make her wear an apron or stand in corners or pretend she didn't exist. The $5,000 paid 2 months of rent. After that, she didn't need Grant's money anymore. She didn't need his world. Elijah went back to school. Nobody there knew what happened. Nobody recognized him from the video. His face had barely been in the frame. He liked it that way. One afternoon, his teacher assigned a project. Write about a time you learned something important. Elijah stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he wrote, I learned that people don't see you until you make them. His teacher gave him an A. He didn't tell her why he wrote it. Caleb Monroe called Maribel a week after the game. Your son has a gift, he said. Maribel didn't correct him. She knew Elijah didn't have a gift. He had patience. He had discipline. He had 2 years of sitting in a corner, watching people who thought he wasn't worth noticing. Thank you, she said. If he ever wants to learn properly, I'll teach him, Caleb offered. I'll ask him, Maribel said. She did. Elijah said no. Not because he didn't want to learn. Because he'd already learned what mattered. People underestimate quiet. They mistake stillness for weakness. And that mistake was the only edge he'd ever need. One night, Maribel sat with Elijah at their kitchen table. The apartment was small. The walls were thin. The faucet dripped no matter how many times she tightened it. But it was theirs. She looked at her son. Do you regret it? Elijah looked up from his homework. Regret what? Playing that game? He thought about it. No. Why not? Because he needed to lose, Elijah said simply. And I was the only one there who could make it happen. Maribel reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You're 12, she said softly. I know. You shouldn't have to fight battles like that. Elijah shrugged. Someone has to. And that was the truth of it. Not every fight is fair. Not every battle is chosen. But some people step into the ring anyway. Not because they want to, but because no one else will. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse that felt too big and too empty, Grant Holloway sat at a poker table alone. The deck was still there. The kings still haunted him. He hadn't played since that night. Hadn't shuffled. Hadn't dealt. Hadn't bet. Because every time he looked at the cards, he saw the same thing. A 12-year-old boy who didn't speak unless he had to, who didn't move unless it mattered, who watched for 2 years while the world assumed he wasn't paying attention, and when the moment came, didn't hesitate. Grant picked up the deck, stared at it, then set it back down. Some games, you don't get to play twice. Some losses, you carry forever. And some lessons cost more than money. They cost the one thing Grant valued most, his image, his control, his belief that he was untouchable. Elijah Cross taught him otherwise, without raising his voice, without making threats, just by being patient enough to wait for the right moment. And when that moment came, he didn't waste it.